recording.
Okay. So this guy's going to talk to you about macro photography. Hopefully you enjoy it. All right.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Gabriellilecture Camera, for letting us all come here and talk about macro. To give you a little background, I describe myself as a photo generalist. I don't specifically shoot macro, but that's where I'm most passionate about shooting. And so everyone knows, I am filming this video as part of a requirement for my adult education master's program. If anyone's not okay with that, I'd just ask if you could move to the back row so you're out of video.
So,
I just asked that
I'm
you
in
make
it
me
right
look
now?
skinny. Yeah.
Yes,
yeah.
it is a
so
wide
fat
angle.
guy on the end of a wide angle.
Wide angle at 17.
Never a good look. All right. It's fine.
Okay, why do I like macro photography and why did I decide that I wanted to get into it? I was always reaching the minimum focusing distance of my lens. I always wanted to get closer and macro options were the only route. You don't need to go too far to find a subject. Another reason why I love macro. If you're busy and you have to drive to go shooting, you're passionate about it, all you have to do is go into your backyard, around the house, and there's tons of subjects and a lot of different approaches to shoot each subject. It's also incredibly challenging. You're working at usually high f-stops, you're always looking for more light, you need to compensate with ISO and shutter speed and still come out with a good image. And when you start getting into these close ranges, you see all kinds of detail that you'd never expect to find in the image, whether it's a little fly that the grasshopper is about to eat, or anything, tiny water droplets enhancing the photo. They really pop in macro photography. And the stuff we'll talk about today is specific to macro photography, but it also is applications in all sorts of photography, like concept of shutter speed, aperture, ISO is the general triangle of exposure, and it's applicable to all sorts of photography. Now, how do I achieve my macro photos? I shoot on the full frame Canon 6D. It doesn't matter what you're shooting on, whether it's Sony, Canon, Nikon, Pentax. They all have incredible sensors, and with every generation of camera, they're just getting better and better, letting us do more. I use the 100mm f2.8 IS macro lens, and as well as Kenko extension tubes. And the image stabilization will allow me to get shots at lower shutter speed than the rules of hand-holding allow, as well as the 9 rounded aperture blades will, when we stop down, keeps our backgrounds looking smooth. To get more light, I frequently use my ring flash, as well as on-camera regular speed light, using a diffuser cap to bounce, or off-camera flash triggers to get more light into the image. And as well as tripod and cable release are essential tools with still life macro photography, allowing you to let in more light over a longer period of time. This is the example when I was shooting on a crop sensor with the Sigma 18 to 35, which is available for all platforms. It has a relatively good minimum focusing distance, but still isn't as close as I want. Here's one with another lens that is labeled macro, and it allows you to get pretty close, but not close like this. And I want you to keep this picture in mind, because I'm going to discuss how I achieved it near the end of the presentation.
Is that the 100?
It is not just the 100. So, thinking to the previous picture, what was I using? What are the strengths and weaknesses of the image? And we'll talk about how I could have improved it. How do we define macro? Is it one-to-one reproduction, which a true macro lens allows us to get, which means that the image we're allowed to capture is the same size as our sensor, or is it anything, I've heard it described as anything greater than what a 50mm lens allows you to get minimum focusing distance. There's no right or wrong answer, it's just what you're looking to work with. And this was not at 1-to-1 reproduction. I was further back, but it fills the frame and allows you to see detail that you can't see with the naked eye. Reproduction is larger than if you had been, when it's blown up on a cell phone screen, for example, it's bigger than real life.
Is that full frame?
This is a full frame. So, slight crop. Now, what are our different options for achieving macro photography? We have diopters or close-up filters, reversal rings, extension tubes with electronic connections, and as well as dedicated macro rings. And as you can see at the end of the presentation, there's also bellows. Now, there's pros and cons for each, and just a brief overview in this chart shows you the cost if you can retain infinity focus and if it allows for aperture control. Now we'll look at a more detailed look right after the switch. One of the gear things that I have not mentioned that I keep with me at all times when I'm shooting macro, if I'm having a hard time finding a subject, a spray bottle. You add water droplets, can make the image more interesting, brighten the colors. Now into the gear. What more appropriate place to talk about it than a camera shot? We have the diopter or close-up filter. It's a filter that screws on to the end of the lens. Will be sharpest in the middle, and because of the convex nature of the shape of the filter, it will decrease in image quality as you go towards the edges. But for pros, they're inexpensive. They're relatively cheap, and they will not make your bag heavier. When we're on the long hikes, heavy lens like a dedicated macro lens will definitely feel it at the end of the day. Another con would be it's specific to the filter size of the lens. So for each lens you have, if you want to use it for macro features, you need to match the filter to the size of the lens. When you have a diopter on, you will also lose infinity focus. You will not be able to focus at subjects further away from the end of the lens. You'll be working within a finite amount of space. And that is shared with many of the options other than the dedicated macro lens. Reversal rings. Now, these are interesting because on one end of the filter, it's just a ring, and on one end it's the same as the mount of your camera body, and the other is a filter threads. So you can mount any lens to your body, including non-manufacturer lenses with different mounts. And this is convenient because we can buy one of the cheap film lenses and mount it to our digital SLRs, and it will also add the ability to control the aperture with the aperture rings, where otherwise there's no electronic communication between the camera and your lens when using a reversal ring.
Can you show us what that looks like, that reversal ring?
I'll have examples at the end of the presentation that Delaware Camera has supplied. I don't personally use a reversal ring, but they are an excellent way for achieving macro photography, and they're inexpensive as well. Extension tubes. This will make the space between your camera sensor and the lens greater, allowing you to focus closer to your image. You can use multiple extension tubes stacked on top of each other. They're inexpensive. The cons with these, as with the reversal rings, is you lose your autofocus. You have no aperture control unless it's a manual lens. You will not be able to infinity focus, and with extension tubes you're adding more space between the lens and your camera sensor, and it will decrease the amount of light let in, making the challenge of lighting even more difficult. They also make electronic extension tubes that retain aperture control, and this will allow you to stop down to increase your depth of field. And there's no added glass as with the close-up filters, so you're not decreasing the image quality of your lens. Here's an image I made using a 36mm extension tube with a macro lens to get closer. And on higher resolution screens, you can see the individual details in the eye, as well as hairs. Even 1-to-1 macro lenses will not allow you to get this close. You need to add something to your macro lens to get these types of close-up shots. The dedicated macro lens is the best option. Well, they're optically very well corrected. Their corner-to-corner sharpness is extremely good, and it will allow you to have more versatility when framing your subjects. The best part about this is it's just another prime lens when you want it. In my case, I'm using the 100mm, so it fills a void in my focal lengths in my bag, and it is great for portraiture as well.
How much is that lens roughly?
$950. It was just marked down from $1150 to $950. And here's a portrait I took of the dog with the 100mm macro lens. None of the other options when attached to your camera would allow you to take a picture like this while doing macro work, because you lose infinity focus and you would not be able to achieve focus on the dog. Now, the cons to a macro lens would be the price. For the cost of that macro lens, would that lens make my photography better, or would a set of extension tubes, tripod, and a flash make my images look better? I think it's better to go with the option where you're fulfilling multiple needs in photography. Many of our lenses say macro on them, but our reproduction ratio is much less than 1-to-1. Like most kit lenses will have a macro feature. I know on Canon, the 40mm 2.8 pancake lens says macro, and it will allow you about 40% reproduction ratio. There are lenses that say macro that are not true macro lenses that will get you up to about 70% of your sensor size, but you'll struggle with insects, water droplets, any type of small subject. It's a lot like that. Now, deciding what option is right for you. How often do you find yourself shooting macro? Or is this something you're going to be committed to and do frequently? Or is it just something you're going to use once in a while? Like if you're a wedding photographer, are you looking at macro options just for doing ring shots? Or are you going out in your spare time and shooting insects and flowers with it? And it's all depending on your style of photography and how dedicated you are to exploring macro photography. I would recommend electronic extension tubes to anyone interested in macro photography, as they're relatively inexpensive, especially in comparison to a dedicated macro lens. And you can attach it to any of your existing lenses, with one caveat. On wide-angle lenses like the 17-40 that's filming, if you put an extension tube on at the wide end of that lens, it will actually focus with inside the barrel of the lens, so you will not be able to focus on anything. So there is some compatibility issues you might run into, but it's very common for people to put it on a 50mm lens and get up to 1-to-1 reproduction stacking up tubes. This is where learning your gear becomes important. You need to